Hi, I am going to not email, I'm going to mail your feedback for the vocabulary, the video, and the lesson planning. So you should get that in the mail probably on Monday, Tuesday. But I want to give you some sort of general feedback right now. And so I'm going to go over sort of the way that I gave feedback and give you some of my major points that I want you to remember. So the first thing that I looked at was your lesson plan and some of the things I want to remind you of. First of all, what I looked for is a clear statement of what you wanted the student to know and be able to do. So we're talking about performance. And the clearer that is to you, that you can actually see what you want the student to do, the better your lesson is going to be and the more likely actually that they will learn it. And so some things that you all did and some other ideas that you might use for vocabulary. The first one is maybe your goal is for them to be able to define words. A couple of you had lessons where your target, your lesson objective was that students can define words. So that's great, but how? And so there are lots of ways to define words. First of all, you can define a word by giving examples. You can define a word by having students tell you an antonym or a synonym. You can have them define the word by explaining what it means. They can also, I think there were a couple of examples where you had the word and the definition. They can match, so the outcome, the lesson objective might be that the student matches the word to the definition. Now, remember this is symbolic, so that you're asking them to use language to define the word. But defining the word you might have them draw. I think there were some examples where people had students draw a picture, but they had to do something to show you that they knew what the word meant. That should be your lesson objective then. Now, you may do lots of other instructional activities to get there, but that's the outcome, the final performance that you want. The other way a lesson objective might be that you want the students to label or name using the vocabulary. So naming can be through expressively, it can be through speech, it can be through sign, and it can be associated with pictures or words. But be very clear again how you want them to label. One I didn't put down here, but it would be that they also could read the word. That would tell you that they at least recognize the word. That may be your goal as well. But again, you have to think about what you want the student to be able to do, to show you what's the performance. Maybe an objective might be to use the words in sentences. And that begins to work the word into a larger context, not just the association, but they have to then begin to, that would be at the level of syntax and meaning, understanding how to use the word in a sentence. Another might be for them to read sentences. Again, this is what your outcome or your lesson objective might be, to be able to read sentences that have the vocabulary word and explain what the sentence means. And they would have to use their understanding of the vocabulary, the key vocabulary word, in order to tell you what the sentence means. I can see that. I know what I'm working towards. The compare and the contrast of word meanings. Now, there are lots of ways for them to show you that they know how to compare, that they can compare or contrast. And one example was a Venn diagram. So in order to demonstrate that they can compare two concepts, is that they have characteristics over here, and shared characteristics in the middle. Now that's a performance. I can see whether they know and can do that comparison. Some people talked about semantic continuum. If they can take the vocabulary and against a semantic continuum place and they tell you where the words fit on the continuum, that's a performance, and that should be your lesson objective. Another way performance might be to use the vocabulary in a conversation. So this might be focused on social studies, science, and or a book that they're reading, literature, English, language, arts. But your lesson objective or your target is that they actually use the words in a conversation, either maybe to describe, to explain, to narrate, or to give directions. Those are, if you remember at the beginning of the language class, we talked about the functions of language, and those were some of them. So when you plan, I need to be able to see, you need to be able to see where you're going and what you want the student to do. And then you measure what the student did against what you wanted them to do. And that's the part of the planning process. I looked at that. I then looked at your responses to the questions that I had you answer about how you kind of planned this out. The conceptual statements, some of you had very clear ones, some were a little vague. I think the value of conceptual statements really is putting into words what you want students to understand generally. And I think it's a useful statement to share with students at the beginning of a lesson. And so I'm going to encourage you to think about those statements as ways to introduce your topic and your lesson and what the big understandings you want them to have. In terms of selection of words, I want to remind you to pay attention to the context. So if it's a book that you're using, think about how which words are really important to that context. When we just pick random words, we can pick words randomly in a way, but we always have to come back and help the student understand them in the context in which you're teaching it. And so just make sure that the words that you choose, you can somehow relate it to the context, because relationships between words and the big topic are important. So this is my next point, is that you begin in the context, because that helps students learn words. It's easier to learn a word when you have a context. Then you can decontextualize it or go to a dictionary definition. Really use the content and the context in which the vocabulary are being learned first, and then go to the dictionary definitions. Because it's more difficult to apply to other contexts. It's easier to teach them in the one in which it's most important. Perhaps it's the academic context. The third question was about levels of instruction. Most of you were working with association. However, there were several examples of people who were expanding to semantic context. Remember that when you organize your instruction, an active or hands-on is the easiest. So labeling an item and working with something, a hands-on is easier. Then the picture or the graphic or the icon. Then language, which in a way, the symbolic part is when you start working with definitions, that's symbolic. And do it in that order. Don't start with the symbolic language and then go to icons. Start with an active, then iconic, then symbolic. You may not need hands-on. You may just start with pictures. Maybe you can start with symbolic, but always start with the lower level and kind of work your way up. I also talked about baseline, and or I wanted to know what the students knew ahead of time. Here's an easy way to sort of get some baseline and to help students understand, sort of from a metacognitive perspective, what they know and don't know. If you have a set of cards or a set of words that you're using, have the students sort them into 1, 2, or 3 piles. If it's 2 piles of words, I know that word, yes. I don't know that word. I know that word. I don't know that word. And have them sort into piles. It may be that for students as they get a little bit older, it might be, I don't know that word. I know something about that word. And I really know I could define that word. So you have 3 piles. But then you have the baseline. It's a quick way to introduce the words you're going to look at. Then go into your activities. So that's just one way to do that. And then I did video observations. I watched and I wrote, you'll see all my comments. But the things that I want to tell all of you is, the first thing is, imitation is really powerful. When you want them to give you a certain response, whether it's a word response, a phrase, or a sentence, ask them, you model it, and then they have to give it back to you because they need the practice. The model isn't enough. They have to actually give it back to you in some form. It may not be perfect, but look to kind of work to getting the whole imitation. But imitation is important. And get that routine of imitation set so they know they have to do it. Increase the intensity. A lot of times you can do that with pace, and you can do it by making it a little bit harder for them. Some things were so easy, I wanted to just kind of keep pushing it and making it a little bit more difficult, kind of stretching. Increase their expectations. For the most part, I think what I really mean by this is students have to have clear communication. If you allow signs that are not formed correctly or in the right place, then that continues. They don't feel the need to be really clear. You'll understand a lot of what a student says or signs because you know them, but you're really trying to help them communicate to others, and so you have to pay really close attention and make them feel like it's really important to be clear with their communication. And then the organization of instruction is better when you know exactly what you want the student to know and be able to do, and that kind of goes back to the planning part. If you have a really clear idea of what the end is, then you can work the steps from easier to more difficult, but you know where you're going and you know what you want the student to do. And that helps with the organization of whatever lesson, one lesson, or if you're doing a series of lessons. So this is kind of general feedback you'll get, individual feedback through the mail. And what I would like for you to do is email me a few of your thoughts about the feedback. Just what was useful, and if you have any more questions, and what do you think, how are you going to use the feedback? Just a paragraph. I don't need much more. But if you do that, I will know that the feedback was useful to you. So I'll look for your email. All right. Thanks.